So we're looking with this set of slides, we're looking at conscientious objection in Israel in the 1950s, which is a very unlikely place and time to have a movement for conscientious objection develop. In fact, if you remember the video that introduced this second unit, the second week, Israel in the 1950s was a very militaristic country for various reasons. So I'm actually going to summarize here some results for research that I conducted a few years ago, and that you can find published on this journal, which is free access online. So I'm just going to summarize here a few things, and you can find all the quotes and the testimonies there if you're interested. So first of all, an organization called War Resisters International Israel Section was established in Israel in 1946. It was someone called David Engel, originally from Germany, that in 1946 already announced in London at the War Resisters International the formation of a Palestinian group of WRI. Remember that Israel did not exist at the time. It was mandatory Palestine. So we should understand this Palestinian group of WRI as Jews living in mandatory Palestine. So at this meeting in 1946, the group chooses the name as War Resisters International Israel, WRII. The chairman of this organization is called Nathan Hofshi, and the secretary is called Joseph Abileach. Just a few words on these two characters, if you want, these two individuals. Nathan Hofshi was born in 1899. He was a religious man. He was born in 1899, so he was the oldest maybe of the group there, and for this reason too he was made the chairman. His conscientious objection was a mixture of religious and socialist/internationalist values, and because of this he also acted a little bit as a theoretical spiritual guide for the younger generations, and he very often made references to holy texts to inspire or to teach younger generations of objectors. And so I direct you to the article to read some of his quotes and examples taken from the sacred texts. So in this respect, if you go back to the scheme of conscientious objection developing in stages, Nathan Hofshi really represents stage 2 maybe, when conscientious objection is adopted on religious grounds. The secretary of the organization, as I mentioned, was Joseph Abileach. Abileach was was born in Austria in 1905 and immigrated to Palestine in 1927. He was a musician, and in his own CV that he submitted, I think, for obtaining, in fact, discharge from the army, he wrote, worked for Jewish Arab cooperation since school days, and he was a member of WRI Israel since its foundation, and was active in a number of other internationalist organizations like the International Civil Service, for example. These are all movements which spring up and spread after the Second World War as an attempt to build bridges of understanding between youths of countries which had been at war. Now, Abiler told the story of his turning to non-violence, and then making it a way of life in various instances. To summarize, he during the 1936 riots, the Great Arab Revolt, as it is known, he encountered next to a well a group of Palestinians who threatened to kill him, a fate that he accepted, and this non-violent stand somehow convinced his opponent not to kill him. So, very briefly summarized, this is the story, but this is the reason why he chose non-violence as a philosophy of life for the rest of his days. Now, how many were there? How many conscientious objectors, apart from Nathan Khofshi and Abiler, were there in Israel in the 1950s? In 1950, in fact, about 50 people participated to the national conference locally, and in 54, Haaretz, the newspaper, estimated that there were about 100 conscientious objectors. These were described, and I'm reading together with you, as strange idealists, but of exceptionally high moral standard, ready to suffer great hardship for their stand. They refuse to serve in the army, but I know some of them who are the first in every voluntary public service. Their refusal is based on a deep conviction, and they cannot be taken as people who want to evade service for ease or comfort. Which brings us back to the theme, is civilian service the opposite of military service, or they both respond or want to serve the community from completely different points of view. So obviously the journalist of Haaretz described this first group as individuals very committed to society and to the state from a pacifist point of view. In fact, not from a peace movement point of view, but from a pacifist point of view. Many of these early conscientious objectors were vegetarians, spoke Esperanto, and were more pacifist than accepting the army as of serving in the army as a means of necessary means of defense in certain circumstances. But I'll return on this. The association had a very articulated socio-political vision of what was going on in Israel and with the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that was clearly very critical and very antagonistic, very different from the views of mainstream Israeli society. The image that kept these people together and that informed their activities was that of humanity as a family, as a community of brothers that shared the same values because they were human beings. So this was the whole base of their vision, and from that derived that citizenship should not be based on ethnical homogeneity, for example, which is one of the strong point of any nationalism, if not ethnical, at least cultural or national. And another differences or another element that kept this group apart from mainstream society is that they had an internationalist horizon that Israel in the 1950s certainly didn't have. Israel in the 1950s was a rather provincial place, closed on itself, and focused on after all, on the success of the foundation of the state. These people, the members of and the objectors of these organizations, had a different horizon. They had connections internationally. They wanted to go abroad. They wanted to meet with other internationalists and pacifists because they felt that the cultural climate was rather suffocating after all. So what we have in the 1950s for this first group, we have a very active core of maybe 100 people, very cohesive, a group, however, of sympathizers around them, and many subscribers to the publications that the organization in London was sending over to subscribers. So we can really talk of an organization that works in, which is structured in circles. As I mentioned earlier, some of them were vegetarians, spoke and corresponded in Esperanto. Others were Shoah survivors or their children, and these were total conscientious objectors. When we look at conscientious objection in Israel, we discuss very often the notion of selective refusal or of total objection. Israel has, from the 1980s, as we shall see, has developed more groups which are groups of selective conscientious objectors. This group is different in that it's made of total conscientious objectors. They refuse draft, they refuse to wear uniform while doing alternative civil service, they refuse to carry and use arms, they refuse army pay, army food, even in prison. Very often they refuse to sleep in military buildings. They refuse to serve in medical corps, which is considered non-combatant service and which very often is offered as a compromise between duty to serve and the conscientious objector. So this is the group. The problem is, what did they achieve in this the first few years of their organization? Well, they did not succeed in having any provision for conscientious objection included in the draft law that was passed in 1949. And so in this respect, they really failed, because if we look at civil society as one of the sites where negotiation with the state authority is ongoing for the transformation of political reality, this was not even considered in this law that was passed. So what was left was to defend those who wanted to object and negotiate for them the best possible conditions that would allow them to assert objection as an individual civil right and therefore not go to jail. So that's what they tried to do. And if you look in the article, you will find a number of cases which really brought the association to the spotlight in the mid-1950s, starting from the case of Amnon Zichroni, who was in fact the first Israeli conscientious objector who was born in Israel rather than being born abroad, and who decided to object after having joined the army rather than before being conscribed, which provoked a very strong reaction from the authorities. You can read about that in the article that I've mentioned in Open, the one called Hello Pacifist. So if you want, we can go on. And what I'm going to look at now in the next few slides is what were the fields, what it really meant in terms of outlook on the political situation. What did it mean to be a conscientious objector? Because it was not only about refusing draft, it was also about criticizing politically or criticizing or objecting to a number of political laws or situations that the members of this association saw as fueling war. And I'm thinking particularly of 3 or 4 elements. First of all, the question of the Israel nationality law. Israel nationality law was, or also known as the law of return, was passed in 1950. And, for example, as you know, the law of return allows every Jew who sets foot on the land of Israel or in the state of Israel to claim citizenship. But the criticism of members of War Resistance International Israel section was that, for example, non-Jews were excluded from the same mechanism of granting citizenship. For example, Palestinians who had not been, who were not in the country when the law was passed. For example, they, as one of them said, even if we could justify our stand with regard to the distinction made by the law between the naturalization of Jews and the naturalization of non-Jews, we could under no circumstances justify such distinction with respect to those Jews and Arabs who are already in Israel. There is no way of cleansing the defilement of discrimination. So this was one of them. Natan Khofshi protested this law, calling it an insult and a wrong new law imposed upon our brothers and neighbors, meaning, of course, Palestinians. The direct sufferers from this law were considered to be the indigenous population. And given all the debates that exist today on the question of indigeneity, of Palestinians being indigenous to the land, I just want to remark how easily this group of conscientious objector defined Palestinians as the indigenous people of the land without much of the debate which has been going on recently on this topic. So this is just an example, but another point that conscientious objectors of WRII condemned was the behavior of the state towards Palestinian refugees, which they called Arab refugees, together with the rest of the population and of the press. And so the behavior of the government towards Palestinian refugees and towards their property. And we're talking here about both externally and internally displaced Palestinian. And most of all, they were criticizing, as one of the reasons that would fuel war, the spreading of militarism in Israel's society, with a special focus on education. For example, when it appeared that sort of a military training would be introduced compulsorily in schools, that was not the case afterwards, but there was the impression at some point was that the Ministry of Education would insert a military training program in schools. In fact, the Natan Khofshi, in fact, protested the establishment of this planned program with very strong words. For example, he wrote, years ago, we and the civilized world witnessed with horror how the most wicked and vile dictators of the Gentiles poisoned the youth of their countries with the venom of militarization. We saw the terrifying fruits of the doctrine of the sword grown by the military education of fascist Italy's and Nazi Germany's children. We, parents, brothers and sisters, demand hands off these children. And so on. Let the Jewish schools imbue its pupil, young and old, with the teaching, love thy neighbor, with the sublime role of Hillel, that which is hateful to you, do not do unto your fellow man. And so on. So, as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, Khofshi very often returned to religious texts or images or expressions to make his points. And finally, as a fourth example, many of them objected not only to the military, but also to, they promoted a fiscal objection, meaning that they didn't want their taxes directed at supporting the war effort, the army, the Israel Defense Forces, or related institutions. So very briefly, what were the consequences of being a conscientious objector beyond the military? They were quite serious in the sense that conscientious objectors did not have the army papers either to apply for an exit permit to go abroad, and therefore their international and internationalist perspective was cut for them in a way. They had difficulties in finding jobs and works in government departments and in in national institutions. Some of them could not be admitted to the Hebrew University when food was still rationed. They did not have the booklet without presenting papers from the army in order to obtain the booklet for food rations. And it was actually a Bilea, I think, that explained for the officers in London how the mechanism worked. And I'm reading this with you. Any man or woman in military age has to submit his or her army booklet or release while applying for an exit permit. As most of conscientious objectors have no army booklet at all and no official exemption, no application for an exit permit is accepted from such members of our group. Young people who are not pacifists are denied permission to leave the country according to the need and urgency of their service in the army. Ration booklets are issued for food only. They are not permanent and are renewed to the population at irregular periods of time, every 1 or 2 years. Last time, the procedure was like for exit permits. Every person liable for army service had to present his army booklet, and so on. So, if these are the difficulties that they encountered, here we have a direct testimony of one of them, called Mayor Rubinstein. His problem was that he could not get out of the country, and he wrote in 1954, I have left no stone unturned, have spared no time, no effort, no money, yet my travel documents are not ready. Now it is certain that I will be unable to attend the conference, and as to the participation in the work camp abroad, the prospects are not favorable either. I had agreed to the formalities of registration and medical examination, but refused to swear the oath of allegiance to the army, even in its modified form, especially arranged to meet the demands of a CO in their view. The consequence, no exit permit. The Ministry of Education as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, both in some ways concerned with the work camps, were unfriendly and declined to be helpful. I have the impression that the officials of both ministries do not favor independent work camp movement where people like we are active to prove the sincerity of our convictions, to promote Arab-Jewish friendship, and where young people come in touch with us and might learn about peace in the ways by which it will be achieved as we think. So this is just an overview of what was going on in War Resistance International Israel section in the 50s. In the 60s, the situation changed, but I will leave the 60s and 70s for now until we get to 1978, where the situation was completely different. So please follow me there. Thank you very much.